Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Um our audience. Welcome to our episode, Africa I Share Online Podcast, the Africa we want, where we'll be talking about issues that are so dear to the continent, particularly how best we can address the problems that we have. Because we always hear that the solutions to African problems do lie within Africa. So it's a platform that we try and come up with solutions on how best we can deal with the issues. So today's conversation would be on foreign aid and a little bit of conditionalities. So we're going to be unpacking what foreign aid is, how the fundamental question really is, does Africa need aid? We know that Africa has been getting a lot of aid from Western actors for a long period of time. But then I don't think there is so much to show for it as far as development is concerned. So we are pretty much contributing to the existing discourse on whether or not Africa needs aid. And if we're going to conclude by saying Africa does not need aid, then what could be the alternate solutions to aid? So before I really give a historical background to this whole concept of aid, maybe if Christine could introduce herself and just talk about this.
Yes, thank you so much, Shido. And good evening, good morning, everyone. It's great pleasure to have you listening to us again. And this topic of foreign aid, as Chido has highlighted, is quite important for Africa, especially right now with COVID and the potential that the economies of Africa will be affected. And I will let Chido speak a bit more about the background to it and a bit more on the topic.
So, well, just to give maybe a brief outline of what foreign aid is. There are basically different types of aid. We've got humanitarian or emergency aid, which is generally mobilized and dispensed in response to catastrophic situations, right? More like your cyclones, pandemics, and everything. Then we've got systematic aid that is basically paid to governments, either government to government, which is bilateral aid, or through or via multilateral institutions or regional blocks. So we are basically going to be focusing on systematic aid that has got concessional loans and grants. Concessional loans being money that is lent at below market interest rates and is often it always have much longer lending periods than ordinary commercial market loans. And then grants, which is really given for nothing in return. The concept of aid, from my understanding, it started, well, I would want to start it in the 1940s, right? Just before the Second World War, at the Bretton Woods Institution, the Bretton Woods Conference. So in 1994, there was a Bretton Woods Conference, which was basically trying to come up with solutions for the aftermath of the war. They had experienced the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was the Second World War, and they were trying so hard to try and prevent the outbreak of another war. So they set basically trying to restructure international finance because the whole gold system had failed, to try and establish a multilateral trading system and also construct a framework for economic cooperation. So it's during the Bretton Woods Conference that we saw the birth of the International Bank on Reconstruction and Development, which is now known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And also, that's when they tried to come up with the International Trade Organization, which failed and was then replaced by GATT, a conversation for another day. So what then happened was, aftermath the war, they were trying so hard to try and reconstruct Europe because of the devastating effects of the war. So the reconstruction agenda, we have got other beneficiaries. We had beneficiaries in Europe, such as France, Denmark, and Netherlands, and actually that developmental funding that contributed a great deal to how Europe became an industrialized continent. So, well, it didn't really work well. That's when they had what they called the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s, I think 1947, 1948 thereabout, where the US basically embarked on an aid program for 14 European countries to make sure that they reconstruct Europe. So it's this whole idea that the Marshall Plan seemed to be a success, that they decided to dispense some of the funds that they had to the African continent. So they looked at the successes that had been registered in Europe, how Europe had become industrialized, infrastructure had been built, and people were moving away from poverty and the aftermath effects of the Second World War, that they felt that aid could also work and try to reconstruct the continent of Africa. And I feel like it came from, I'm sorry, but I think it came from a position of feeling pity and sorry for the continent, because you have got the then UK Prime Minister Tony Blair saying that the state of Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world, and the West should provide more aid for the continent, which basically makes me feel like the continent was pretty much like a begging basket. We were a charity case, or maybe a charity case, I'll put that in quotation marks. And the West feels like they've got a moral obligation to ensure that they give aid to the continent. So yeah, and you would realize that as we speak right now, there is over $1 trillion that have moved into Africa in the form of financial assistance for development to eradicate poverty and ensure that there's infrastructure development and actually realize development. So I'm just going to pose a question to you in light of the background that I've given. The money that I've told you has gotten into Africa. Do you really think that aid actually works for the continent?
From what you've said, actually, the few things that I picked is when you say like it was almost like a charity case. I was reading an article that was trying to analyze the aid between Tanzania and Norway, and someone was comparing it and saying that it's like the Good Samaritan game theory, where Norway is asking itself, should we be a good Samaritan and give this aid without any conditions? Like just be a good Samaritan to Tanzania, or should we have some conditions attached to it? So it's almost like you feel like it's supposed to be charity, but it's almost like the person who is doing the good deed has conditions attached to it. I'm sure as we move forward, you'll speak a bit more about the conditionalities. But to answer your question thing is that Africa's received so much aid, and this aid could be in the form of grants, waivers of interest on loans that have been given to Africa, and African countries have gone into debt distress and they have asked for the interest waivers. Waivers have been given, and there's ongoing aid coming from US. If you look at it, in so many African countries, you'll find US aid, DFID, you'll find the German aid. There's so much aid that has been flowing into Africa for these many years. But when you look at it, it's until, for instance, China started constructing roads in Africa or rebuilding airports, that you're actually seeing that there's actually roads, there's actually an outcome of like a form of infrastructure development of a kind that's tangible that you're seeing in the continent right now. Right now, you can pinpoint to countries and say this road has been built off China. This other development has happened, for instance, in Ethiopia off China. This has happened in Uganda, and for all these years, you can look at it and see nothing much has happened. I mean, if it's like the poverty rates, like if you look at a country like Djibouti has a population of 1 million people. It's reported that 40% of people in that country live in poverty. So, and aid has been flowing to all these countries. So when you ask me, does aid work? I'm tempted to say no, it doesn't, because you're not seeing any positive outcome despite the conditions given on it, despite the amount of the aid, despite how many times you go for it. There has been no outcome for such a long time. I'm telling it's until recently that you can pinpoint and say there's an airport that has been constructed. No one has heard of the US aid funds going to construct an airport in any country. Like I haven't heard of
Yeah.
it. I haven't heard of like German aid going to construct a railway line in any African country. So you wonder, money yes has come into Africa, but is it the conditions that are attached to it? Is it the use that it has been put into? It's uncertain where the money has gone, and certainly corruption is a big deal. And we can argue on one hand, like if I can give an example of IMF, World Bank, and I think a Chinese foundation gave like almost $1 billion to Kenya to help deal with the COVID situation. Recently, there's been a scandal where $250 million has gone missing from that amount that was given as aid for COVID. And when they have traced it, like from the scandal, it looks like what happened is that people gave a tender was issued to people who are related to certain politicians or people who have certain conditions. Like this is what's reported on BBC and so many other networks within Kenya, that what happened was that people either overpriced the PPEs that were being supplied, so that you see someone is tendering to supply PPEs at three times their price that the government would have bought them for. And so at whooping $250 million has gone missing in these COVID times where Kenya doesn't have enough ventilators, but the money has gone missing. And now there's a parliamentary committee that is trying to figure out this dilemma. Where did the money go when we all know where the money went? But it's such things. So does aid work? To be honest, it doesn't seem to be working. But you can speak a bit more on what you think is the reason why.
You know what? I really liked what you said, that we have had so much influx of aid, but it doesn't seem like there is anything to show for it, right? The problem that happens is when there's concessional loans or there's grants come to African countries or anywhere else, people are not really told what to do with the money, right? The conditionalities, which we are going to talk about more in detail, most of them really are hinged on political development and respect of human rights, accountability, transparency, and the form of democracy that the donor understands, right? Which is something that we're going to talk about. I don't necessarily think that aid does not work in its entirety, right? Because, look at it. When financial assistance for development started influxing in Africa, it was not a new phenomenon. It's not something that they sat down and just decided to implement without having tangible results of its implementation somewhere, right? Like I said earlier, it had been done for Europe, and Europe developed. So they felt, when this, when your US, your Great Britain, your German, the EU, when they were looking at it, they felt that it was also going to help Africa develop. So I think the problem, I'm going to cite, a number of issues that I think are the fundamental problems that we have as a continent when it comes to dealing with foreign aid. The first one, I'm not going to start blaming ourselves, but I'm going to try and give you a different perspective, particularly with regards to the inflow and outflow of money. I remember, I think I told you that I'm kind of working on a study on illicit financial flows from Africa. And you would realize that on average, Africa gets about, let's just say, $135 billion in the form of financial assistance. Right? That's a lot of money, and we expect something tangible to come out of it. But nobody also then pays attention to the fact that Africa loses roughly $200 billion every year that goes out in multinational profits, that goes out in externalized funds, illicit outflows, right? We talk of having to service the loans, the repayment plans and everything. So it's pretty much getting 130 but losing 200. So we've got a margin of 70 billion, right? That is just getting out of Africa and nobody's accounting for it. If I remember very well throughout my research, I came across a study by Global Finance Integrity that was really looking at the amount of money that is lost by Africa, by most African countries. And it's so sad that most of the extractive countries, you talk of your Nigeria, you talk of your DRC, Zambia, they lose a lot of money through illicit financial flows. You talk of your tax misinvoicing, you talk of money laundering, and that is the money that could have otherwise been used to actually work towards realizing socio-economic rights. Nobody has a conversation around it. So in a way, the money that, before I even finished that thought, I remember reading somewhere where this guy was making an argument about round tipping, right? Where the money that comes in the form of foreign aid pretty much goes out as illicit flows. And the money that goes out is then round tipped and comes back to Africa as foreign aid. But this time it has got conditionalities. This time it has to be repaid. This time we know it's now in form of a loan that has to be repaid. So it then becomes an issue of, we are getting money from you, right? But at the same time, we're going to give you back your money, but this time you still need to give it back to us. That's why you realize that most African countries, as we speak right now, they are riddled in debt, so much of debt. We have got countries that continuously go back and try and renegotiate loans, concessional loans, so that they at least be given an extended period to pay, because they can't pay clearly, right? They can't service their debts. The debts are becoming so unsustainable, but at the same time, they still need to go back and borrow. Which brings me to another side of the argument, Christine, which is not really blaming the funders or the donors, but actually an argument where I'm saying we need to look within the continent. Aid, because it's something that has been going on and on and on and on, and we've got our governments continuously going back to beg and borrow. It has created a culture of dependency whereby most countries now actually depend on foreign aid. Do you know that there is an African country that has got 60% of its annual budget that is actually set aside that it's going to get from foreign aid?
Interesting.
60% is a huge percentage if you look at it. How can you have a country that pretty much depends on foreign aid to an extent that almost 3/4 of its annual budget is basically based on money that they are going to borrow? Nobody talks about giving that money back, right? So the culture of dependence has actually led us to let off our leaders the hook. What do I mean by that? I'm basically saying there is now less accountability in Africa. We can't hold our leaders accountable because they are not doing anything for us. They pretty much are relying on the money that they're going to borrow from the IMF, the money they're going to get from the World Bank, the EU, the US, right? And it's the same money that instead now for them to start building roads and building infrastructure for the people and making sure that people actually make a transition from poverty to probably middle class income. That's the same money that they used to fund political elections. That's the same money that they are using to fatten their pockets. I'll bring you to this. I was reading this book. It's called Why Nations Fail, which basically says the problem with most developing countries, not just Africa, but most developing countries, is leadership there is more like a take, right? Developing countries, they've got political and economic systems that are just extractive. So what happens is a political leader gets into power, so
Mhm.
that they extract money for
Mhm.
themselves and the people that are close to them.
Mhm.
It goes back to the conversation that we were having last week about bad leadership and governance, bad leadership and accountability, right?
Mhm.
So because we don't have accountability, right, we can't hold our political leaders accountable for the money that they're actually getting. The few money the few dollars that they are getting, aside illicit flows and everything, nobody's there to hold them accountable. So at the
Mhm.
end of the day, you realize that leaders that are actually not doing anything for their people have managed to stay in power for a very long time because they rely on aid. In a way, I would say we can as well apportion a certain level of blame to foreign aid, because we're saying there are leaders that could have been removed from power, right? But
Mhm.
those leaders still find themselves being in power because one, they're not doing anything. Two, there is no accountability. And three, when it gets hot in the kitchen, they just go and borrow money and bring it back and try to do one or a few things without actually doing anything.
That and I agree, especially when you're speaking about like round tripping. Like this is a concept that happens in tax a lot. And if you find like what countries will do, and for instance, like Africa has been said to lose a lot of tax revenue by just giving tax incentives so that you can attract foreign direct investment into the country.
Yes.
But what happens is that you find that in a country, I'll give you like an example is, or most African countries, they have either free special economic zones or free trade zones where anyone who comes and sets up there for 10 years, you pay no tax in 10 years. So what foreign companies will do is that they will come and set up there for 10 years. Then after 10 years, they pack up and leave because and so
Wow.
you've enjoyed the tax incentives, you've paid no tax revenue to that country, you've made money out of that country. You truly do, because especially and it's a completely total tax free. Because any money you make in the country, you don't pay any corporate tax on it, and you can push the money out of the country without paying any tax on it, which is unlike someone who is paying tax. At least there's the revenue that goes to the government, and then there's no requirement like to transfer technology. So even as you park, you fold up and leave as a company, you leave that your employees, the people who are employed in your company, leave them without jobs and without any skills transferred to them. So this money has gone out of the country, and then you'll probably come in another form back into the country as another form of foreign direct investment or something. You just somehow find a way of, and so I agree, because of the dependence thing, what has happened is that you end up not even having logical economic laws. You don't, because you're not
Yes.
thinking too
Yes.
clearly
Yes.
and trying to preserve the country. For instance, like what happened with China, they noticed that China also, for a while, had different tax laws that apply to foreigners and domestic companies, and they gave a lot of favor to the foreign companies. But at some point, the Chinese domestic companies were like, no. What has happened is that now the foreign companies are competing way much more than we can compete. They are getting tax-free treatment, and China had to relook and say, you know what, we will give the same. If no one is paying tax in this country, no one will, like, whether you're domestic or foreign, then let's not charge anyone tax. Instead of saying like, let foreigners not pay tax in the country, the domestic companies are the ones who are bearing this tax burden, and then the foreigner just leaves. It's quite the situation. So I agree. And like for China, they revised their laws, but that's because they were thinking through these things, and possibly they're not relying on aid or grants, or they're not looking to it.
Before you continue, I just wanted to say that it's very funny that most governments, right, they pretty much fail to set up efficient tax collection facilities due to the reliance on foreign aid.
Mhm.
We constantly, we like to make an argument that most. I think this is an argument that we make as a continent when we're trying to negotiate at the multilateral level and everything, that we so depend on revenue collection, your customs duties and your export fees, to an extent that we don't think we can liberalize our market as developed countries, because then we'll lose a huge chunk of our revenue. But if you then go back, like just go back a little bit on that argument, you realize that it's fundamentally flawed. Why do I say so? We actually don't have proper institutions for tax collection. The same tax that we go around saying we so need for our revenue. And do you know why it's like that? Like you've said, there are so many incentives that are there that don't make sense. It's because ultimately we know when the year ends and we're about to draw our budget, we're just going to go back and get money from those people, and they'll give it back to us. The same money that is left is tax incentive.
True.
It's a cycle that just does not end. It's a cycle. If you look at it now, I'm just going to say this and you come in. If you look at it now, aid becomes bad when we look at it from an African perspective. And it entirely has nothing to do with the donors or the funders. It also we have a part to play as a continent, right? We have a part to play. Not only the leaders, not only the leadership in some African countries, but even the people within those countries, because they are not holding their governments accountable. It's public knowledge. And when a government gets money, it's public knowledge. You can get it on social media. You Google it. You come across the statistics, right? So it's high time that we, the African people, actually go back to our governments and try to hold people accountable for the money that they're getting. Even the COVID relief money that you're talking about, it's not a Kenyan problem. Most African countries right now, I'm going to tell you this, there are going to be commissions of inquiries in most African countries trying to inquire where COVID relief money went to, because ultimately figures were pulled, money was released, somebody got the money, but they didn't deliver. So if we stop take mentality and actually start working towards developing our own economies, I think we'll just continue blaming aid. We'll blame the Western. We'll blame China. We can even start blaming Israel for all we want. But the problem is with us as a people.
To be honest, I wouldn't agree more. And when you're speaking, that even got me thinking, as even you go to speak about conditionalities, I'm wondering, do you think Africa, instead of, because I was reading somewhere that some European countries are now looking at, especially the COVID situation in Africa, and instead of giving money, they're saying that we'll send actual equipment. Like we'll send ventilators, we'll send PPEs, we'll send, like we actually, because if you send money, I was thinking that a source of scandal, even this equipment will come and it will just disappear, and it will be taken by the government and sold back to the government. But and then also I thought a different alternative is because there's also the kind of assistance that they give by maybe giving scholarships to like people from within Africa to go study and equip them, or especially like if you see some scholarships that require they finance you, but then you have to give an undertaking that you'll come back to Africa and live there and develop it within a certain, like use your skills to develop. So sometimes I'm starting to wonder, this aid sometimes, if it's not working in the sense of sending, the money will come into the country and the money will an entire huge amount of money will disappear. And so is it better than to fund researchers? Is it better to have like research institutions established within Africa where like researchers can research within Africa? Is it like equip give human capital, because it looks like a revenue, like cash capital is not helping Africa, but how about human capital?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
You know what? You raise a very important point that literally just ties in with some of the alternatives that I had, right? So the first thing that I think the West need to do is to stop giving Africa money, right? Stop giving Africa money, number one, break the cycle of dependence, right? Because the moment we no longer have that option for financing, we are now forced to go back on the drawing board and start thinking about what we want to do so that we survive, right? And if you look at it, there is always an argument that is raised about, so I will talk about social enterprise, FDI, and how that basically supports the argument that you're talking about basically where you're saying we need to develop human capital, right? So with social enterprise, it's literally premised on this whole idea that we need to prioritize social impact over profit, whereby we empower the locals through skill development and job creation, right? Once most Africans become self-reliant, it's not the government that actually needs to be self-reliant. It starts with the person who is within a particular country, right? Let that person be empowered. They need to be empowered not to be given money, but human capital, right? Mental capital. Number two, even when we talk about foreign direct investment, the whole idea for foreign direct investment is not that for them to come in and build hospitals for us, but it's that they be skills transfer, technology transfer, and the know-how, right? That's the fundamentals of foreign direct investment. I think we tend to undermine the importance of technology, know-how, and skill transfer, that we are so worried about getting the 51% shareholding. We are so worried about getting some money when we are negotiating this contract, that we don't really go back to the drawing board and think of what's important, right? So the first thing is, yes, instead of giving Africa money, instead of giving us equipment, we don't need equipment, because in some countries we have cases where that equipment has been sold. You have no idea who it's been sold to. It's crazy. Let's have research institutes, think tanks that are funded, right? Not for the sole purpose of fattening the pockets of the people that are actually heading those research institutes, but so that they can come up with innovative ideas and policies that can inform government, right? We can't always expect policy to come from government, to come from our leaders, when we don't play our part also to do research for them and try to do a cost-benefit analysis and weigh and inform policy one way or the other, right? We have got countries in Africa that don't have research institutes for anything. I'm so concerned about trade space, because that's what I do, right? You don't have research institutes that focus on trade and investment policies. So you end up having the government just relying on probably pulling a document from another government and then just changing titles and passing it off as a new document. And you realize that in most circumstances, those documents are not really contextual. So the point that I'm making, let's start by developing human capital, right? Let's have this research is funded, given, even if they have to be given textbooks, because just so that there is no money that just crosses hands, right? The second, when we then start talking about foreign direct investment, when these Western companies come in, it's our prerogative to make sure that the contracts that we negotiate, they have to be based on a policy that there should be skills transfer, there should be technology transfer, so that even when they go out 10 years later, we know that, okay, we had Tesla, which was developing self-driven cars, right? By the time Tesla moves out of, let's say, South Africa is already developing its self-driven cars. It also is improving from those self-driven cars and actually doing something else, so that at the end of the day, we become self-reliant. The problem is we can't even look up to the AU for any assistance, because the AU itself is not even self-sustaining. The AU itself is also donor funded, and you can't blame it, because we've got countries that do not pay their annual royalties. So the question becomes, there is nothing in Africa that is self-funded. There is no country in Africa that doesn't need aid. But we don't have anything to show for it. So let's start by developing human capital. The problem is we have a lot of people that are going to Western countries, getting scholarships, getting places, studying there, and then staying there and continuously developing Europe, right? But you can't blame them at the end of the day, because even if they come back to Africa, they are not given the platform to express themselves enough.
Like I saw someone saying, like, especially in Africa, just to put in what you said, is that in Africa the problem is not lack of skill, lack of talent. Is that even like if you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kenya, or if you go to the Ministry of Industrialization and Trade, and you are the most qualified person with a master's in international trade, having worked for WTO, it's very unlikely you'll get a job. Someone will give that job to their relative. So
No,
why should I
no.
come
The
back to
relative
work in
who has
Kenya?
no experience,
Hmm.
the relative who has no experience,
Yeah.
uh, I don't think Africa has no skill.
Hmm.
Africa, we do have skill, but we're not given a platform to express that. I was reading this other article. I was happy because one of my people is the CEO and founder of driverless car manufacturer called Cargo,
Mm-hmm.
who's now staying in the UK, right?
Mm-hmm.
That guy started his own startup that manufactures driverless cars. He's
Mm-hmm.
Zimbabwean.
Mm-hmm.
You see the problem that I'm saying, that it's
Yeah.
not that we don't have skills.
Mm.
We do.
Mm.
We do have skills. Just think about it, just think about it. If you go on Google right now and you try to search the number of scholarships that are available for African students or that are available for people from developing countries or least developed countries, there are a lot of them.
Mm.
You have got governments constantly competing that they get people to go and study abroad and come back with the skills.
Mm.
But then the problem is when they come back to the continent, they are not given a platform to
Mm.
put those skills to practice because the take mentality, the extractive mentality that we were talking about. You won't be surprised that we have got people who are occupying very top positions, influential positions in those multilateral institutions, but they are not really coming back to empower the continent because they are not given a platform to do that.
Mm.
So they go out, they work in Washington DC, they work in Geneva, and then they retire.
Mm. Yeah. And I wouldn't blame them too
But
much because what's the
yeah,
point of coming back to the country even if you have experience
exactly.
from Geneva and never get even a job opportunity, and not even in the private sector you can get it. But what you think needs help is in the government sector. Even the government sector, hiring is always on nepotism, tribalism, and such things. How will you ever get ahead if you don't get competitive talent? And someone literally just won't hire you because you're not from their tribe or you're not from a certain
Yeah.
tribe. If that's the criteria that the government still wants to hire on, it's just always going to go round in circles. And there's talent. Sometimes you wonder, does the government ever wonder when these multinationals come and set up, for instance, in Zambia, when McKinsey or a big consulting firm, PwC, goes sets up in Zambia, and there are people from Zambia working there, doesn't the government ever stop and wonder how is it that this top company is able to come and get people from Zambia to come and offer their talent here, and us as the government we are unable to get people with talent? The government is well aware that its people are talented, but do they want the talent? No. Do they want someone who
No,
can make a difference in the institution? No. They just want to
no.
have the option to go and negotiate something that makes no sense truly, but which is
You know, you know,
benefiting someone.
you know, the problem with I don't think that's a coincidence. It's a deliberate move because once you put competent people in certain strategic positions, right? We are not talking about political offices.
Mm.
We are talking about offices that are for economic development. Once you put somebody in a strategic position where they're able to influence real economic policies that actually bring about change, there comes the concept of accountability, something that we don't want as a continent.
Mm.
We are not comfortable with having a conversation around accountability. So, up until a time where we are actually willing to sit down and talk about holding people accountable and actually being accountable, right? I'm afraid we're just going to have talk, and look for new people to blame, new countries to blame, right? Like now, we have got a lot of influx from China, Chinese investments,
Mm.
Chinese loans, and everything, right? And
Mm.
I'll tell you for a fact that we are still going to look at China and blame China in the next coming years for impoverishing Africa.
Of course. Of
But
course.
then the question becomes, when the loans were being negotiated, who was there?
Mm. I mean, it's not two
Were they
Chinese
not?
people who negotiated for the African country. There was an African
Yes,
person there.
yes. Were they not aware of what they were contracting into?
Yeah.
That's a very a very important question to consider. Who was there and how did they do it? So I'll still maintain that AIDS on its own is not bad. The problem starts when it gets into somebody's hands.
Mm.
The
I,
moment it gets
mm.
into somebody's hands, the problem then just starts.
And I think one of the reasons maybe Chinese aid is seems to be working for Africa is China came not just with floating money. Well, so there are two sides of it. China has its project, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a China-driven project, which China wants to connect different continents, which is based on the Silk Road of the old times. And China has an idea where it's saying what we are after is connecting through maritime, through roads, through airports. And so what China is doing, it has an agenda. It has an agenda, and the agenda is to lay certain infrastructure in different countries. For what goal? That's a different topic, like for why they are looking to do that. But for them, what they are looking at is that we want to have a network of roads that goes from Tanzania through Uganda out into Rwanda and then goes to Kenya and then Sudan. And so they have in their mind what they are doing. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are seeing actual things happening on the ground. It's not because, for sure, we even had this discussion on a China discussion someday. And what we are saying is that the Belt and Road Initiative is not an Africa initiative. China sat down and they were like, we want to construct a road for you, Kenya. And then they come and constructed the road. Then they're like, oh, we want to construct a dam for you, Ghana. Then they go construct a dam for them. But did Ghana sit down and maybe do, for instance, do like a cost benefit analysis of what they were doing? No. And so it's a project which is not, if China gave money to Africa, it's unlikely we would have gone and built an airport. It's unlikely that Zimbabwe would have
But
gone and built the
you,
parliament. But they are getting, it's because they are out to build this infrastructure. That's why possibly we are seeing solid use of these things. But these things are not, they may not in the long run benefit Africa because, like, for Djibouti, you see, like, they have a railway that was constructed, but they say it's not meeting the capacity that it needs so that it can break even. And that's the thing. We have infrastructure, but we are at the point where we're like, but we don't have industries to use the infrastructure. So anyway, the China situation, I think, is quite interesting.
that China is a conversation on its own that we need to have on a different day, because there are so many sides to the Chinese situation. The other being, when China comes in, there's hardly any skills transfer and technology transfer because they bring everything, including the bricklayer. You get what I mean, right?
Yeah.
So you've got Chinese contractors working in an African country for a Chinese project, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which then becomes the question: what happens to the people that are actually in those countries? How are they getting empowered at the end of the day, right? Number one. Number two, let's also not forget that there are other monies that are not coming in the form of development assistance, that are just loans. And the difference between Chinese loans and the loans that come from the West, it goes back to conditionalities. I hardly do, because this is the thing. China is not a democratic. You can't say it's a democratic government in the sense of democracy, how we've told about democracy, right?
Yeah.
So they can't give a condition that you need to be democratic, they need to be this and that, because they are not a democratic government. So there are no conditionalities, and people just pretty much do what they want. With the Western loans, there are conditionalities, but then there is no implementation in the sense that they don't follow up to actually see if something has been done with the money. Because if they actually would follow through implementation, right, I don't think we could be having the same problem that we're having about, especially with regards to accountability. Because if you come and ask for money to build a road, we expect to see the road being built or the road having been built. We need to see the airport having been constructed. So they just dish out money and then they keep quiet. China follows up, but sometimes it doesn't really care what you use it for at the end of the day. unless it's specifically meant for a certain project.
Yeah, which is to their benefit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to really stop looking at anywhere or anyone for financial assistance, right? I'm really happy so much that we are launching the African Continental Free Trade Area, because I believe in the concept of free markets. I think that we can achieve so much with free markets. And the good thing about the African Continental Free Trade Area right now, going back to just maybe to give you a heads up, going back to the issue of taxes that you're talking about, customs are going to be working together to ensure that they do away with this whole concept of, some countries not having adequate infrastructure or institutional frameworks to ensure that there is revenue collection. So it's a good thing, right? Once we open our markets, so we have talked countless times here on this platform about how Africa is so rich that we need to actually look at the value that we have and be competitive globally. With the amount of resources that we have, the natural resources we have as a continent, we are so blessed that I don't think we need to be a begging basket. We need to be going to someone and begging for assistance for anything.
Yeah, I think there's potential and we can do a lot with it, but I think we just want to sleep, be fed, be given aid, be given grants, and just steal the money and just, we are happy.
It's like that. I think we need to do institutional reforms in country by country.
Yeah.
And ensure that there is proper accountability. Because even what we're talking about free trade, we're talking about foreign direct investment, we're talking about having to invest in social enterprise. It will not really yield the desired result up until a point we are able to be accountable as people. We need to deal with accountability. When there is accountability and every dollar is accounted for, gives us, when we go back to having proper institutions, right? Institutional reform, as I'm talking about, it even goes back to deal with this whole idea of illicit flows, right? That are getting out of the continent. So we need to put plugs on those holes through which money is leaving the continent. We need to ensure that there is accountability, and then actually start investing in things that matter. Trust me, will rise.
Yeah, and like when you're speaking about, I know we are almost running out of time, but I think from what you said, especially sealing the loopholes on like money leaving, illicit outflows of money, I think South Africa is a good example to learn from. I know most people don't like South Africa in the sense that you just can't transfer rands out of the country without there's foreign exchange control. Like you just can't just shift money out of South Africa, the rands, without getting approvals. And most investors don't like that because if you want to get a certain amount of money out of South Africa, there's an amount that you have to pay tax on. And so you have to either way you have to, if you want to divest from South Africa and take all your money out, or you want to just have illicit flows out of South Africa, then you pay a price for it. It's a different story how South Africa is using its money. But I think for like at least in how you can seal the loopholes, I don't think we'll be shooting in the dark. The other people are doing it. I don't think it's for lack of information on how to do that. I think it just needs to be done, like you really can't have like a country which is like without borders, it's just, there's no borders in your money. Anyone can bring in money, take it out, do anything without any form of accountability. And that's how come you'll find like every once in a while you hear a scandal from an African country politician who has Swiss bank accounts, which no one knows how much money transferred there. So like all the money that went missing during COVID aid, all of it went to Switzerland, and the politician holds money there for years. Like such things. It's things that can be controlled, and we don't have to wonder how do other people do it. We know how it's done. Just have it done. So I agree. Like institutional reforms are a big part on winning this whole game for Africa. I think so.
I totally agree with everything that you have said, and you've really managed to summarize the conversation. And I think in the best interest of time, we can as well end it here. If we need to do a part two, we definitely will see with the feedback that we get. But yeah, I think the takeaway is we necessarily don't have to bracket and blame aid for everything. We also I think it's high time, like we've been emphasizing from the first episode, it's high time that we start looking within. African problems require African solutions. And in as much as it hasn't worked in the past, particularly when we are looking at the issue of money and everything, I think we now need to start going back on the drawing board as African countries, people, the government, policymakers, everybody, and see how best we can get out of the situation that we find ourselves in. We need to start having honest conversations.
Yeah. To ask you a last question, do you think Africa countries will ever stop going for aid soon?
I don't think they would.
Yeah.
In all honesty, I don't think they would because of the benefits that accrue. Like I was saying, there are people who are, I would say, they are pretty much living off aid. They have neglected all other concepts of development, all other drivers of economic development, and they are solely dependent on aid.
Yeah.
So having situations like that, I don't think we are going to stop going back for aid. And see how the statistics for poverty are pretty much going up by the day, right? We have got the World Bank making estimates that by the time we get to probably 2030, what they call FCVs, fragility, conflict, and violent states, are pretty much going to be worse and so ridden in poverty. So as long as we haven't done so much with poverty reduction, we are constantly going to go back. In fact, we're going to be using it as a justification for why we still need to get money.
Yeah.
It's more like with the AU. Like I said, the institution needs to be running, but countries are not faithful enough to actually pay their monthly subscriptions, right? I think in 2015, 16, thereabout, only 67% was collected. So ultimately, it still has to rely on foreign aid, an institution for Africans by Africa relying on European aid. It does not make sense at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It does not.
I think we could go on and on, but even the Africa Union building was built by China, so that speaks a lot.
So. I think the initiative has to actually come from the donors and start limiting aid, cut aid to Africa and see if that doesn't force us to actually think and come up with innovative ways to make sure that we drive for economic development.
But I think we could have that discussion again in future, but I think it benefits external aid donors to keep giving aid to Africa. I think for them, because this is like, they of course know this strategy where you keep Africa down, you can get resources out of Africa easily. They are not accountable for anything. Like, it doesn't pain the US a lot that they gave aid to Africa and the entire money was looted. It doesn't pain them. It pains us. And so US would not be bothered. They'll keep pumping in the money for whatever they can. And then in any case, it's leverage for them to negotiate to get a military base in Djibouti or somewhere. So I think it's in their interest to keep giving aid. So I don't think it's in the interest of China to keep giving aid to Africa and building our parliaments and such buildings, and it's in their interest. They will not cut it. It's for us to say no.
And then the problem with us saying no is we'll never get to a point where we say no because we want it. We don't need, we want it.
Yeah.
Amata Sen talks about development is freedom, right? But I don't think with this dependency syndrome that has developed in Africa towards foreign aid and having to depend on the West for financial assistance, we can really talk about development in Africa, because development is an all-encompassing term. It's something that we talk about sometimes, where we talk about economic freedom, political freedom, social freedom, and everything. So once we're still dependent, in as much as we might try to talk about development, it becomes so difficult because there is no freedom. The conditionalities that we wanted to talk about, but we never really got time to talk about. You see, it then just becomes a question of who is going to stop aid? They are not going to stop aid because it's beneficial for them. And our governments are not going to stop asking for aid because they want it. I'm not going to say they need, they want it.
It's convenient. Who doesn't want to get extra money without working for it?
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Again, we say good day, good evening, or good morning. Please let's hear your comments, particularly on this issue and all the other issues that we've discussed. What is it that Africa has to do? You can also suggest other topics that we can look at so that we start having honest conversations. Ultimately, that we may be able to come up with the Africa that we want. And this is Chido and Christine for you again until next week.
Bye. Thank you.